Sawmill owner, Constitution instructor, and keynote speaker for many civic groups and organizations. We could think of no star brighter to MC this event than Mr. Peter Boyce.
I'm humbled that I would be selected to MC this event. I'm not an expert in Common Core, so perhaps, as Jan said, I'm a Constitution instructor. Perhaps I was chosen for my knowledge about the Constitution, but I suspect that it was more that I'm to be the comic relief during the heavy doses of solid information that you'll be trying to absorb from these speakers. These are the top speakers in the country on this issue. These four women are determined they're going to kill Common Core in the state of New Jersey. There's Jan Lennox. John Mellon. It's been a tremendous amount of work to put this event together. Oh, first, let me give this phone number. Write this number down, the blank sheet in the back of your program. It's an important number. We'll be getting into it later on in the event as to why this number is so important. Actually, both of these numbers. With that, I'd like to introduce Reverend Christopher Mann for the opening prayer.
For a moment there, I thought I was the joke. I would ask us to please stand and bow our heads in prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
We hear in the Gospel of St. John that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that He is the truth that sets us free. And so, Lord, we come to you today, to Jesus Christ, our Lord, our Savior. And we ask Him to bless this convocation of parents, of educators, and of concerned people who are concerned for our young people, that they would be learned or taught the truths that set us free, along with other truths that help us to thrive in a free world. Help us, Lord, to know that truth and to pursue it vigorously and zealously and to spread it throughout the whole world. Lord, bless each of our speakers especially, that they may have a light of your knowledge, that they may have words that are filled with grace and truth, and that those words that they speak will take root in our hearts like little seeds that are planted, and that we, each in our own way, in our own walks, will be able to share that truth with others as well. That what we share here doesn't die here, but this is just a flower pot in which we all will grow. We ask this in the name of Jesus our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
And I would ask us to now face our flag and to pledge with me allegiance to our flag. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be seated. That was the Marine in me, by the way. I spent 6 years in the Marines.
Fashion model. Her interests include ancient history, pistol target shooting, photography, and volunteering at her church. Ladies and gentlemen, Janine Loretta.
I want to know how everyone is doing today. I said, what's up, Patriots? It is a beautiful day for liberty
today in our country. We're here from New York. We were in Washington the other day. We are all over the country for liberty, for love of country. And I want to thank all of you for being out here today on a Saturday morning. Think about it, because we love country. We love liberty. And I had the amazing opportunity to deliver this message of liberty to Americans across the country. Because as Americans, we are blessed with opportunities where anyone can succeed. Not by race, not by how much wealth you come from, but hard work, perseverance, and the freedom to make choices and decisions that are best for you and your family. It is about freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But sadly, my friends, we are at a crossroads in our country. Government overreach is looting us of our liberty, of our freedoms. Thou shalt do what the government says. From light bulbs to what kind of car you drive, how you heat and cool your home, health insurance, and education. Our liberties are being reduced. And it's all about control. Government gone wild. Government bureaucrats and the elites, they think they know what's best because we're too stupid. We don't know what we're doing. Well, let's talk about the real world. In reality, life is tough. There will be winners, there will be losers. But in this great nation, I am a testimony to that. In this great nation, anyone can succeed. And part of achieving success is having a good education. Those are the fundamentals. Every child, regardless of color, economic background, deserves a quality education. Every child is unique, individuals, which creates a fundamental need for teachers to have the freedom to teach. Not teach to test, but teach individuals based on their individual core needs. And parents should have the ability to have a say in how their child is taught and should know what their child is taught. So enter Common Core. Here are a few words to define Common Core. Conformity. To behave in a conventional way, especially in accepting, without question, customs, traditions, and prevailing opinions. Conform. Common, a commonality, a purpose, methodology, and material. Common Core, an attempt to create compliance to norms and standards and educational objectives, classroom instructional methodology, and the text and testing that is used. Conformity, commonality, common. Nothing about individualism, nothing about independent thought, creativity, competition. And teachers are spending way too much time teaching to test and not teaching to teach. Common Core is meant to even the playing field by giving every state a universal set of standards to measure learning. And the program is incentivized with federal grant money. That's being given to states that implement the standards. If you don't get the funding. Common Core is a set of uniform national curriculum standards in math and language arts, developed by Washington, D.C.-based organizations with zero accountability to states, to schools, to communities. It's also surrounding requirements with Common Core eliminates local control, limits parental involvement, opens the door to invasive data collection, provides little options for reform, and caters to special interest influence in individual classrooms. It's not about the children. It's not about the children. So, who are some of the players involved in this National School Board, that's what I like to call it, top-down education initiative, where they don't care about children learning or what their actual needs are? Bill Gates and Melinda Gates, they were mentioned earlier. No, they don't have a stake in this, do they? They have a big stake in this with their software to be provided for data collection, among other things. Former Governor Jeb Bush and his Foundation for Excellence in Education, well, they get a lot of money from some big donors to promote this. Microsoft, GE, Intel, State Farm Insurance, and the Gates Foundation, just to name a few. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and business investor Warren Buffett. They all have a stake in this. Now, here's a little background about these individuals with their big involvement in this initiative that is affecting families across the country. Combined years in classroom experience, 0. Impact on public education is limitless. And your ability, you, each and every one of you here, and those who are not here, your ability to have a say in this initiative, it's eliminated. You just listen and do what we say. Well, members of committees, or what I like to call the club, or the insiders, these members, they were handpicked by special interest groups, not representative of the 45 adopting states. So the comments that were made by those who did receive the opportunity to review what the initiatives were, they weren't really reflected in the released standards. The outsiders, I like to call them. So let's take a look at the insufficient feedback and lack of public dialogue on the creation and implementation of Common Core state standards. Parents were left out, students, teachers, educational experts, campus administrators, central office administrators, school boards, city councils, community leaders, and state representatives. Where's the transparency? And where's the accountability? Government should be local. I repeat, government should be local, where the citizens have a say of what is going on in their communities and what affects their families. Let's look at the privacy aspect, where in some cases, parents were not given an opportunity to opt out, sharing their children's personal information. So what can they measure and what data can they collect and store about our children? Their names, attendance records, disciplinary histories, addresses, and test scores. So let me just make a point here. I grew up in Burlington County, New Jersey, and some of these data points would not have allowed me to be where I am today if I was going to be watched from cradle to grave. My parents separated when I was young. When that happened, I became a very angry little girl. And I took my frustrations out on anyone who came in my path. My parents, my siblings, my teachers. I was fighting in school constantly. Almost got suspended. So my grades suffered. I had disciplinary problems, detention. I had an assigned seat in the detention room. That's how bad I was. And when you think about it, that is what a lot of children are going through today. Anger issues. And I thank God that I was able to turn my life around. But if we have this bureaucratic overreach, mining our children, every move, every say, every action, I am someone who would not be in the position that I am in today. This is what we got to keep in mind, is government overreach, looting us of our liberties. Now, in addition to these traditional data points, they can collect more than 400 individual pieces of data on students, hobbies, medical conditions, learning disabilities, religious affiliations, family income, behavioral problems, at-risk status, dwelling arrangements, career goals. They want to know everything. And then there are the costs that are associated with Common Core. They're astronomical. And we're talking about materials, textbooks, assessments, equipment, technology. Then there's the training for the teachers, administrators, and data coaches. Databases, implementation, operation, and management. These costs are massive. And then the other costs are where teachers lose the ability to be creative and teach individuals the way they need to be taught. And the other loss, local communities lose control if you don't have a say. And don't forget, President Obama recently introduced Preschool for All program. Preschool for All. This focuses on early childhood education from 3 to 5 years old. This includes data systems for daycares and preschool programs. Access to data that I previously mentioned. Remember, they're 3 and 5 years of age. More than 400 pieces of information. And you'll love this one. Health and Human Services partnerships. Yeah, they want to emphasize the importance of home visits. Government overreach in our everyday lives. Under this program, suggestions on raising taxes, raising sales taxes to continue the funding after the grant money has ran out. So who are the losers again? We the people. We the people are the losers. My friends, as government grows, our liberties are reduced. And it is time for all hands on deck. And that is why I'm here really, to implore that you get involved, have a voice, and take action. Because if we sit back and do nothing, we are going to lose more and more of our liberties. We all have a role to play, whether you're a parent or not. You're paying taxes. Whether you're a parent or not, we all have a role to play. Parents need to be aware of what their children are being taught in school and how. Get involved, ask questions, have that conversation. And if you don't have children, you're a taxpayer. So find out what's going on. Get on the school board. Go to those meetings, PTA meetings. Make those phone calls. Send those emails. Some suggested resources, freedomworks.org. We have a wealth of information online about Common Core. We have information over here at the table. Visit commoncorefails.com. That'll be very helpful for you. And also, review Common Core legislation in states and find out what other states are doing as well. I've recently been appointed president of conservativereview.com. And this is an initiative, a website that provides the profiles and voting records of our members who forget that they work for us. And we need to continue to remind them that they work for us. Find out where they stand on Common Core, what they're doing about it, and why. Ask the questions. Go to their town hall meetings. My friends, the message of liberty is about empowering individuals to pursue our dreams and goals. That doesn't come from government. That comes from us. And I can tell you, I have been on the scenic route pursuing my dreams and pursuing my goals. I didn't always know what I wanted to do. I didn't always like the jobs that I had. But I tell you, I thank God for the opportunity to be able to stand before patriots such as yourselves, to educate you and to help you get involved, because that's why we're here, to help you. And as I close, my friends, I want to leave you with this thought. Our country does not guarantee you success. But liberty guarantees you the opportunity to succeed. It's all about liberty. It's all about freedom. And I hope each and every one of you will help play a role. God bless you all, and God bless America.
I'd like to introduce Dr. Christopher Tinkin.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Jan and her committee for having me here this morning to speak to you. What I'd like to talk about today is I'd like to just question some of the assumptions of standardization and centralization of public education. And I'd like to do that through an evidence-based lens. So I'd like to provide a very quick overview of standardization, some of the major assumptions made by policymakers and bureaucrats who suggest that standardizing public education is the best way to help children succeed. I'll provide you an overview of some of the assumptions that the Common Core is based on. I'll also talk about this idea, are our children really lagging? Because that's one of the reasons given for the need for standardization policies, is this supposed lag of American students in comparison to other students around the world. And then also, I'll raise some questions about this idea, can one intervention serve the needs of almost 50 million public school children and millions of others of private school and homeschool children? Many of the comments that I show you today come from my writings. If you go to my website, I have many different research reports on there. They're free. And so also some of the comments come from my book, The School Reform Landscape, Fraud, Myth, and Lies. And that's where I take apart every major federal reform since Sputnik and show that, in fact, it was not built on evidence, but ideology. Also, if you happen to be on Twitter, feel free to tweet me comments, and I will tweet you back following the presentation. On some of my slides, you'll see my name and the name of some articles. So those articles you can download immediately right onto your smartphone, and that shows you where I'm getting my information from. They're all cited and researched. So the lenses that I look through this issue with, I look through them, number one, as a social scientist. I am a full-time professor at Seton Hall University in the Department of Education Management, Leadership, and Policy, where I work with people who want to be principals and superintendents and education researchers. So I look at the issue, one, through the lens of a scientist. But I also have children in the public schools, 3rd grade and 1st grade. So I view this every day from the lens of a parent. I'm a former assistant superintendent, middle school principal, assistant principal, director of curriculum, and I started my career as a teacher. So I view the issue once again from that of a teacher. And I'm also the president of my town council, so we work very closely with our school board to deal with issues that we may have a mutual interest in. So I look at this, first, at education, as someone who's been in it, working around it, is a profession based on science, evidence, and artistry. And I also look at it, one, we cannot just be doing things to kids without the evidence of what we're doing is effective and needed. Because at the end of the day, over 50 million students do not have a voice at the policy-making table. And so it's up to the adults to be that voice. And we need to have a voice of evidence and a voice of reason. So when I look at the current reform landscape around the country, what I see are a lot of policies and proposals that seek to standardize, centralize, and homogenize the public school population. And those proposals are also trying to reach into the private schools and homeschool sector. An excessive use of testing to track students, but also the use of testing to monitor the implementation of these policies. We've created somewhat of a mousetrap So teachers are increasingly stuck in a situation where they're being forced to do things that they know might not be the best things for kids, such as excessive test preparation, turning the curriculum into preparation for one test, turning the school into a test preparation factory, if you will. So what are some of the assumptions made by standardizers around the country? The major one that you hear all the time, that people try to scare us with, is that America's children are lagging behind their international peers as measured by results on international tests. You hear that constantly. School administrators hear it all the time from their state departments of education. And the importance of that, we are told, is that somehow these tests, one test, two tests, given to a very small sample of kids, can actually predict the economic success of a country. That's a pretty stunning claim from someone who studies this for a living. Also, the argument is, well, we can fix all that with a standardized set of outcomes and tests to measure those outcomes. And that standardized set of outcomes is good for everybody, all types of kids, in all types of school districts, in all types of communities around the country. One specific assumption of the Common Core, it's been on the website and it's in many of the materials, and supporters of the core will make this either explicitly or somewhat covertly, is that the Common Core will improve academic competitiveness, global competitiveness of U.S. students. But I'm going to question first, I want to question this assumption. Is that even worth pursuing? Is it worth pursuing a test score on an international test? Well, only if the test results mean something important. So this idea of argument one, students are lagging on international test scores, is only meaningful if those test scores actually do predict future economic success or future security of a country. But if it's all just dataless decision making, then we potentially have a problem. So my kids, they like Scooby-Doo, so I promised them I'd put a Scooby-Doo slide in here for them. Front row. Unfortunately, all the standardization, the centralization, the corporatization of our public school, private school markets might not be necessary. Because I'm going to show you just a couple quick slides. I have a lot more research on this on my website, along with other colleagues who have been looking at this issue for many, many years. But I'm going to question, are U.S. students really lagging? And are these tests even meaningful first? So why don't we ask the people that make the tests? And so I'm one of the people that reads these 500-page technical manuals. Yeah. Enough said, right? You know what I do on weekends. So when you dig into these test manuals, the people who make the tests tell you none of the scores or ranks are valid indicators of the quality of an education at the country level, nor can these scores predict future economic security. Those are the people that make the tests, the people who are selling us the tests. They warn you of that. You know, you have to get past, page 5 to see that. Most bureaucrats don't do that, but I do. A lot of reasons why one test can't tell you everything you think it can. First of all, the international level, there's generally only about 6,000 to 10,000 kids that take these tests. And in many of the countries that take them, the testing populations are not representative of the students who attend the school. For example, the United States does a really good job, I don't know why that's forwarding, a really good job of having a representative sample. The kids who take these international tests represent the kids who are in our schools. But in countries like Singapore, well, you don't find students with special needs or second language learners in the public schools that take these tests. In China, for example, most kids, less than 50%, are in high school, are in school at age 15 when many of these tests are taken. Many countries don't test their non-native language speaking students, their special needs students. They're very selective in who they test. And beyond that, there is no evidence that one test could tell you everything you need to know about the largest and strongest economy on the planet. These tests are also very sensitive to factors outside of school that influence achievement. Also, we know that these tests, one is called the PISA, the other is called the TIMSS. They don't measure skills that matter. Because, in the G20 countries, the largest economies in the world, it's not 19th century skills that are driving those economies. It's things like creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. I just finished a study with a colleague of mine this summer where we compared the rankings of the largest economies in the world to the rankings on these international tests and international indexes of creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And what did we find? There is no relationship between how a country ranks on these tests and their creative, innovative, and entrepreneurial output. So I question, why would we be chasing a score on a test that isn't going to give us the things we need to remain number one? Okay, another research study that we'll be putting out in 2015, another colleague of mine, we actually found that it's really all about the economics preceding the test. So how strong your economy was, the level of childhood poverty in your country preceding the test, that makes the difference. The test score does not predict economic success in the largest economies in the world. Now, we can certainly chase around little economies if we want to, but I seem to think we swim in a bigger shark bowl. Yeah, I did another study that I did 6 or 7 years ago. Even back then, there was no relationship between any ranks on these tests and economics. Okay, here's a picture of math performance in the largest economies on international tests and the relationship to childhood poverty. So this test, the PISA test, is very susceptible to out-of-school factors. It tells you really more about the economic conditions of the kids who took the test than what they know. I'm not sure how helpful that is to school administrators who are trying to advance the academic performance of kids. It certainly shouldn't be used to make national education policy. And that's because we know that poverty has a lot of power on these tests. We have about a 23% childhood poverty rate. If we were to drop that to 10%, like many of the other countries that take these tests, our rankings move from 29th in the world to the top of the world, top 10, mathematics. 15% poverty moves us to 12th place on the PISA and 5th place on the TIMSS. So poverty alone counts for more than a 50-point increase in these scores. But yet you're being told that a standardized education program is needed. And we've looked at every test, gone all the way back to the beginning. The first international test ever given, 1964. Went through every single one, compared that to indicators of economic success at the national level, have not found relationships between the ranks on these tests and major economic indicators for the United States or for the largest economies in the world. Is it true if you were to take the economy of Ghana and you were to raise the education level of everybody in that country to 8th grade, their economy would improve? Yes, but we are in a different pool. We should not be comparing ourselves to weaker and smaller economies. They are not our competitors. But that's exactly what the purveyors of centralization policies do. They try to scare you by telling you your child is behind. So the Global Economic Forum, those are the folks that meet in Davos, Switzerland every year, they know some things about economics. They consistently rank us at the top of the world, the strongest economy, the most competitive economy in the world. on the Growth Competitiveness Index. So what most of these bureaucrats and even some researchers fail to do when they compare countries on these tests is they don't compare apples to apples. And so I say it is really fruitless. And you just thought he was the only one telling jokes today, right? It is really somewhat fruitless to compare ourselves to smaller economies with very specialized testing pools that really don't do the things that we do in this country. These are all countries that outrank us in international tests. I'm not concerned about Portugal eclipsing us economically. Not concerned about Estonia eclipsing us economically. You know, I always laugh at this thing called Singapore math. Might be a good program, but there's a fervor around it. And so I ask, you know, Singapore is a small country. Estonia outranks us too. Why aren't we doing Estonia math? Why aren't we doing Hungarian math? I always love, being at Seton Hall. I'm up in North Jersey. And so Singapore has about 5 million people. And so where I work, we call that North Jersey. Right, when I'm doing this down in Dallas or Texas, we call it Dallas-Fort Worth. When I'm out in LA, we call it LA. We are why are we comparing ourselves to a country with 4 million, 5 million, 6 million people? We have more kids in the public school than they have people in their entire country. We are, in fact, different. So when I look at all of the evidence on international tests, the evidence, not the ideology, not the rhetoric, but the evidence, I see no connection between that and economics for us. I don't see a reason we should be chasing international test scores. And I certainly, from an evidentiary point of view, from a social science point of view, from a research point of view, I don't see why we should be basing national or state education policy, or even local education policies, on something that is a myth. I think we can do better for our children. But let's take on this idea of U.S. students lagging. Now, I'm going to make an argument. I don't have a lot of time to do it, so I can't show you a whole lot of data, but I am going to make an argument that we're not lagging. I am not arguing that we can't do better. Of course we can. Of course we can. But I want to argue that we're not doing too bad. So when you look at, once again, the top 30 industrialized nations in the world, the real competitors, we have one of the highest high school graduation rates in the world. You know, you're told we don't have that. Could we do better? Absolutely. But we're not at the bottom of the world in terms of that. And I want to bring up 2 points. What I'm showing you here are international data. And in the international community, they define graduation 2 different ways. A student who graduates on time, as defined by his or her country, and a student who eventually completes high school or the equivalent thereof. Now, the federal government has decided to change the high school graduation definition in this country to 4 years, even though there's a fair percentage of students with special needs who are allowed to take until 21. If they take more than 4 years, they are not counted on time. So even with a restrictive graduation requirement definition, we rank 9th. Now, if you look at the completer rate, we rank 6th. And I need you to keep in mind that in some countries, students are considered on time if they graduate before the age of 21 or even 25. So I'm curious if we had an international study on the percentage of students that graduate within 4 years using the U.S. definition, where we might rank, because I think we'd be even higher than some of these other countries. Okay, China, you see the completion rate for students is anywhere between 28 to 44% of their students graduate high school. Okay, also, you probably never heard the fact that we consistently produce, even with all the issues with international testing, we produce the highest absolute number of high scores on science tests around the world. Okay? When you look at schools with poverty rates, those similar to the 30 industrialized countries, we rank near the top of the world on all international tests. Okay, you hear a lot about we need more STEM people, we need more engineering people. And that might be true, although the data suggests we have quite a few of those. But then you look at the quality of the engineers that we're producing. And so based on an international study of human resources people from the largest multinational engineering and IT companies around the world, who produces the most qualified engineers? Well, it's the US. Can we do better? Absolutely. Are we failing? I don't think so. India and China, they still have a long way to go. Okay, so some downstream indicators, and these are downstream indicators. We're not talking about some fourth grade test and how kids did that year. We're talking about meaningful things that drive the economy. The NJ Ask or the PARC test isn't going to drive the economy. We produce more engineers and IT, computer scientists than we can employ. That's a study from Duke University and also Rutgers School of Public Policy. And you look at per million, we're producing the most engineers and IT people per million. So when I look at those numbers there, I don't think we have a problem producing qualified engineers. If you want to outcompete India and China, you better start having more babies. We only have 320 million people here. They're in the billions, right? Okay? So in absolute numbers, yes, they should have many, many more qualified engineers and IT people. Okay, other indicators, you say more of our kids need to go to college. Every student needs to go to college. Now, I don't know who's saying that. I think it has something to do with the loan companies. Now, I'm not saying colleges, of course, I work at college. Please continue to come. I still have about 25 more years left, you know? But what I want to say is we are not failing in the area of bachelor's degrees either. When you look at the industrialized countries, we have a higher percentage than most. We're number 8. Okay, all of them except Japan and UK have very small economies, and almost all of them subsidize higher ed. For example, I'm lucky enough, I have family in Sicily. I'm a visiting professor at 2 universities in Italy, and I get to lecture there on a regular basis. And I remember one time a student asked me, how much does it cost to take a course with you? And I quoted the Seton Hall price. Private school. They looked at me, they said, Dr. T, our whole master's degree only costs 2,700 euros. Okay, so I'm going to show you a list of countries that subsidize their education heavily, and they're not burying us in bachelor's degrees, or master's degrees, or certainly doctorates. Okay, so here we are, around 33%. And really, I mean, things don't get interesting here until you look at Norway. Norway's 46% bachelor's degrees. Good for them. Once again, they're the size of North Jersey. Okay, not concerned. But they all help out with the costs of education as well. You see the EU average? The EU is the largest, when you take them all together, they are considered the largest economy in the world. The EU average, the core, only 20%. The top 30 industrialized countries, member countries of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, 22%. China, depending on who gives you the statistics, 2 to 10%. Okay, our return on investment, number 2 in the world. So the dollars that we're spending, we're getting a big bang for our buck. Big bang. Okay, but what about the things that drive the largest economy, national economy in the world? Creativity, innovation, entrepreneurship. What about those things? Where do we stand there? Okay, well, when you look at Nobel laureates, once again, this is downstream. We own the Nobel laureates in chemistry, economics, literature, medicine, peace, physics. Well, literature we don't own it, the French do. 3 times as many Nobels. Now you may say, well, wait a minute, they're all foreign born. No, they're not. 60% of Nobel winners come from U.S. public schools. I don't know the number that come from private schools. But 60% come from public schools alone. And here we say we're falling behind in science. Once again, we are the strongest country in the world in terms of Nobel Prizes in science. The discoveries in science, they come from the U.S. They come from the U.S. Often when I show this statistic, they say, yeah, but that's all from the space race. You're resting on your laurels. Well, no, not really. Because what it is, I went back and I looked at all the Nobels since the year 2000. 33 in physics. 20 out of 33 were given to U.S. Next closest one was Japan. Not even close. How about chemistry? 31 were given. 20 out of 31. Next one closest, Israel. Not even close. These are U.S. Nobels. Medicine. Somewhat important, right? 35 awarded. 21 come from the U.S. Keep it in mind, 60% of Nobel Prize winners are from public schools in the U.S. In fact, I graduated from Newton High School all the way up in Sussex County, about as far up as you can go. We had a Nobel Prize winner in physics, public high school, Newton High School. Okay, what about utility patents? There's 2 types of patents in the world. There's like bobblehead doll patents, and then there's patents that make all the stuff that you like and make your life better, easier, that drive our economy. Those are called utility patents. Those are the patents that I want. We can let the bobblehead doll stay somewhere else. When you look at the patents, let's just take 2012 because that's what I have for you. The U.S. by itself, at the U.S. Patent Office, the most competitive patent office in the world. We had 121,000 patents. The rest of the world, 132.
It could permanently replace MCAS, but there's a vocal group of dissenters who are very much against it. We're joined this morning by Dr. Sandra Stotsky. She is a former Senior Associate Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Education, a retired Professor of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas, and a critic of the Common Core standards on which PARCC is based. And Doctor, appreciate you coming in this morning to talk more about this. What is your, and I know there are many, but what is your biggest issue with PARCC?
That it is based on the wrong standards, Common Cores.
And Common Core is an issue why? And explain to people what that is too.
Common Core is a set of standards for English language arts and mathematics developed by some private organizations in Washington, D.C. in 09-10, funded by the Gates Foundation, and adopted by state boards of education and commissioners of education without any independent evaluation or expert advice by the higher ed authorities who are actually teaching the graduates of our high schools who are deemed college ready.
This is going to replace, temporarily at least, and perhaps permanently, the MCAS for 3rd through 8th. 10th graders still need to take the MCAS. How does it differ from MCAS? And I know you think MCAS is a better test and a better way of measuring success, correct?
MCAS is better because it's based on first-rate standards. I helped to develop them when I was in the department, so I know how good they are. And MCAS is a much better test, also because it was developed by teachers here in Massachusetts, not by somebody else elsewhere. Part of our problem with PARCC is that we don't know who's developed it and where the cut score or pass score is going to be.
There are a lot of communities, I think 180, that are doing PARCC. Another 130-something are staying with MCAS. Of those, like the city of Boston, who are saying, okay, we'll do PARCC, what do you think they're missing? What are they not getting?
They are missing a chance to have continuity with the MCAS tests that they've had, the trend lines, from using MCAS. Plus, they are betting on the wrong horse, to bring in a racing analogy here, because Common Core is dying now. Everyone knows that across this country. Waves of parents and teachers and unions are now coast to coast rising up against these Gates-funded standards that they never had any.
So PARCC, in your opinion, is a step back, not a step forward.
It's a step backward, but it's a step into blackness, because no one knows what's on the test, who's vetting it. It certainly isn't being vetted in Massachusetts by our own folks.
Mitchell Chester is the Commissioner of Education. He's also on the board of PARCC.
He chairs.
Do you see this as a conflict of interest, even though he's been cleared by the State Ethics Committee and the Secretary of Education?
It's a conflict of professional interest. How can he possibly recommend next year to the State Board of Ed that they don't adopt the PARCC test when he is chairing the governing board of the PARCC test? No, we need to have the legislature appoint an independent group of higher ed experts and testing experts to look at the data from the PARCC test, pilot tests that have been given this year, and to look at the results of MCAS. Remember, MCAS is given in grade 10, PARCC is going to be given in grade 11. So you're going to want to expect the PARCC test to have much higher standards and results.
And lastly, doctors, we're up to you. Would you change MCAS? If it's not broke, don't fix it, because as you were saying, the state has done very well, and when we compare ourselves to other cities, states, countries even, we've fared pretty well.
We have. We got first place on NAEP, which is National Assessment of Educational Progress Test, grade 4, grade 8, reading, math. Can't do better than that. And we were tied for first place in science on an international test. Can't do better than that either. So why are we junking what we did well by? And there's no evidence that Common Core is anywhere close to being as good, nor that the PARCC tests are anywhere as good as MCAS, because I know the teachers that were creating the MCAS test, first-rate teachers in the state.
Dr. Sanders-Stotski, thanks so much for coming in this morning. We appreciate your insight.
That was last Tuesday, that interview. Sanders-Stotski is credited with developing one of the country's strongest sets of academic standards, K through 12. Students, as well as the strongest academic standards and licensure for tests for prospective teachers. She's also known nationwide for her in-depth analysis of the problems in Common Core's English language arts standards. She's regularly invited to testify or submit testimony to state boards of education, state legislators on bills addressing licensure tests, license standards, and Common Core standards. She served on the National Validation Committee for the Common Core State Systemic Initiatives, 2009-2010, on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel, 2006-2008, and she has co-authored, on the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. Her major publications include Death and Resurrection of a Coherent Literature Curriculum, and What's at Stake in the K through 12 Standards Wars. Now that's just a few of the qualifications I've highlighted. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sanders-Stotski.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I thought it would be useful for you to see that 4-minute interview, because New Jersey is a PARCC testing state, as is Massachusetts, and you will be, as far as I know, beginning your regular PARCC test this coming year, as will Massachusetts, except that schools in Massachusetts were given an opportunity to choose between continuing with the old state test and starting full-time with the PARCC test next year. And as I think I mentioned there, or I have told other people, only about 50% of the schools in Massachusetts, school committees and superintendents, have voted to use the PARCC test next year because they had an option. What happens after next year, we don't know, because our commissioner will be recommending after the November election, and we'll know who the new governor is in the state. He'll be recommending next year whether or not the state should fully adopt PARCC tests And as I'm commenting there, and as a member of the Peabody School Committee has recently pointed out and sent in a request, which was why we had the Ethics Commission involved, how can our commissioner, who is chairing the governing board for the PARCC tests, not recommend the PARCC tests next year? It's not going to be easy for him to even try to say we should continue with MCAS, even though it's likely that most school superintendents, if they had their brothers and could speak up out loud, would actually prefer to continue with our own state tests, especially if they could get those state tests based on our pre-2009 standards rather than on Common Core's. Because like New Jersey, Massachusetts has total verbatim Common Core standards. Whether you added things or not, we added something at the beginning and something at the end for ELA and maybe a few math standards in the math document, but none of that is going to be assessed by Common Core because Common Core will only assess what is on the Common Core site. I would like to begin, first of all, with a little broader overview because I was involved in so many of these various different phases of what happened before Common Core. I was on Common Core's validation committee, and I have been a critic of Common Core since 2009, while it was in its developmental stages. So I have been out basically on a stump for over 5 years, and I have been joined by Professor James Milgram most of the time, who was the only mathematician on Common Core's validation committee. He's emeritus at Stanford University, and we have been going around talking about the problems, both as testimonials to state legislative hearings, as well as to larger groups that want to just find out more information about the math and the ELA standards. So we've been going around talking about the problems in the standards, and we stick to only that topic. What are the problems with the standards? We are not talking about any of the other issues because we do not see the issues being necessarily Republican, Democrat, or Libertarian. Pre-calculus is pre-calculus, no matter what party affiliation anyone might have. And there are a number of other issues that are strictly part of an academic curriculum that we think need to be discussed a little bit more. Let me begin by saying that, to begin with, there were 4 large groups of people in this country who were excluded in different ways from having a direct impact on the Common Core standards. First group, which is the group you're now hearing from coast to coast, parents. Parents were not involved in any way in what was going to be imposed on their children in the schools. And it's certainly more than the public schools because we know that Common Core has had a far broader reach in every state than just students in public schools. Second group were the teachers themselves. And this has been one of the most, to me, interesting facets of this whole so-called reform movement. And I say so-called because I do not consider Common Core a reform. It's a regression in many ways to some of the issues we thought we had worked out after World War II when we began to reform, expand, and develop the school curriculum much better than what it had been before World War II. So I consider a good part of Common Core a regression to the public-private problems that we faced after World War II, how to make sure that public schools could offer what good private schools offered, and to make sure that we were then reaching a much broader group of students in our public schools. Teachers were a huge group left out, and to this day, many of them do not understand at all what they are being asked to teach. In many cases in ELA, they're being given scripts, or they have highly paid Common Core consultants coming in. And in Arkansas, I had a grade 8 English friend who was incensed by this $200,000 a year Common Core consultant who had been not trained beyond elementary school and was now coming in and telling English teachers what books they should read and how they should approach developing specific objectives with the books they taught. She was told to dump her poetry unit and a lot of other issues. And Jamie Highfield, the name of the teacher, she was one of the few willing to be identified, was eventually told 2 years ago by her school system, the Fayetteville Public Schools, that she was not to speak in public anymore about the issues she had with Common Core. And Jamie, who had been a Navy veteran, and had been a dockmaster, was not about to put up with this kind of nonsense. She just left after 11 years of teaching in the Fayetteville Public Schools and moved to Virginia. So she is now free to talk completely about what her experiences were, because she will not be shut up about these issues. But she was someone who had taken a course I had taught on standards. We had become friends, so she was willing to tell me about the stupidities of what were going on in the schools during these early years of implementation of Common Core and what they were told to be doing in English language arts in addressing Common Core in a very good school system, because this was a college town. So the teachers were the second group that were not given much of any information, and still aren't, by their own administrators, many of whom don't know much more than their teachers. They're only given talking points by their state departments of education or their governor's office. Then we have state legislators themselves. That's the third largest group. They were totally bypassed in this little dance that took place behind the scenes between a governor and a state board of education and or a commissioner of education back in '09 with a memo of understanding to commit themselves to adopting these standards. It was deliberately decided to avoid state legislators or the legislature because the people who were behind the Common Core project at that point did not want discussion in public. They never have, which is why to this day it's very difficult to find informative discussions of the Common Core itself, what it was intended to do, some of the issues that appear to be buried in it, and to explain some of the ways in which it turned out. So you have state legislators who only about 2 years ago began to get worried about the costs. They were being asked in many states to do something about the high-tech costs for the testing or the professional development costs for the teachers. Those are the two big costs which are going to be forever so far as we can see. And that was when legislative hearings were set up, and they're still continuing. The momentum is increasing. I have testified in about 25 different states, as has Professor Milgram. Legislators typically want to know, what is Common Core? Now, this is 4 or 5 years after their own state board has adopted it, and they are in a quandary because here is a state board that adopted far-reaching policy-bearing standards. They were among the last to find out, if at all, at the time. Most cases, they weren't even given the courtesy of finding out what their state board had done. And yet, they're in some way going to be responsible for changing, getting rid of obstacles in statutes, state statutes, if they were there, because that was part of a commitment in one of the documents that was signed by state board members or the governor or both. And typically, they've now moved on to a different governor, different members of state boards, so they're not even dealing with the same people today who put all of this into effect 5 or 6 years ago, which doesn't seem to matter because the continuity is there as far as the law is concerned. The fourth largest group that were absent in numbers as well as in spirit were local school board members, school committees in Massachusetts, school board members in most other states. They were nowhere to be seen. Yet this was called, and is still being called by some groups' talking points, a state-led project. Well, there was nothing state-led about it. Now I'm going to go into some of the bare facts, which you've heard a little bit, but I'm going to reinforce them, because those talking points are still being given out, and it's very clear by now to most people in the media and to most school people that this was not a state-led venture, because state legislatures can't figure out exactly how to get out of this sticky jar of molasses. Their state boards put them in. If this was a state-led venture, they would be able to get out. And there are a number of different bills going on, and I'm involved in about 4 or 5 states right now trying to figure out wording on the bill and procedures for developing better sets of standards if they want better sets of standards in their states. We know that the people who developed Common Core standards were those 3 private organizations in Washington, D.C., and they were all funded for that purpose by the Gates Foundation. That's common knowledge. Who selected the members of the standards development work groups? We don't know to this day. This is 5 years later. It seems that Achieve Incorporated and the Gates Foundation selected most of the key personnel to write the high school level college readiness standards in both areas. Who was represented on those committees? And this was announced in 2009 and was the first clue to me that there was a problem. I was at that point on the State Board of Education in Massachusetts. It turned out that most of the people on this particular work group were test and curriculum developers. And the question was, how come? Why such people who wanted test developers to be on, and the ACT, CV, Achieve, and NCEE, National Center for Education and the Economy? Who was not represented on the standards development work groups? This is in the spring of 2009. High school English and math teachers, English professors, scientists, engineers, parents, and so forth. And one would ask oneself, well, if you want to develop college readiness standards, remember they have a very important name because we've never had such things before. They've just been called standards, K-12 standards. These are college readiness standards. If you want to have them develop, who are the 2 groups of people you want to be developing high school college readiness standards? High school English and math teachers and college level teaching faculty in those areas. You don't really need other people. Those are the 2 groups that would, for the most part, understand what high school graduates or those approaching high school graduation should know if they're going to be ready for college level work. And for the most part, they were totally absent. There were never any high school math teachers on any of the groups at all that I guess. Standards writers, standards development group, and then the validation committee itself. The 3 major committees set up never had a high school math teacher. It became clearer to many of us why, because that high school math teacher would have been one of the few people to understand the high school math standards, which to this day most people don't understand. Now, can you get records from any of the meetings of any of these groups? No. Everything was done by private organizations, so there are no records of any kind to be FOIA'd. I know all about it because I've been a very active citizen in my own home community. I was a town meeting member for 10 years, library trustee for 14 years. We know all about sunshine laws, public meeting requirements, the need for minutes of meetings to be made available, agendas and so forth. None of that's available. Reporters can't get a thing. We have no idea why people were chosen, how much they were paid, what their contracts were, what the charge was to them. Nothing. To this day, 5 years later, they choose not to give very much information. And so we wonder about with other issues now bubbling up in testing, when the problem still is those standards that were to be the basis for the tests that are now going to be developed next year and may be given in a much smaller number of states than was planned originally, because states are beginning to drop out of these testing consortia that were funded by the USDE, some say illegally or unconstitutionally, and there are other groups developing Common Core-based tests, ACT, that may be providing tests for school systems or states that have decided that the Common Core label is toxic for them, and so they're using other tests. But as long as they're based on Common Core standards, you're still locked in to an inferior system. Let me move to the standards writers, because they were a critical group and very important, as you can imagine. I have put much information about them on many of the websites, items that I have on my own homepage of the University of Arkansas. But so far as we know from their betas, which are not always totally available, in ELA, which I will concentrate mainly on, they had no experience teaching at any level. Neither of them, David Coleman, Susan Pimentel, ever taught K-12 or above. Neither of them majored in English. They had never had any publications of any serious nature that dealt with curriculum and education. How they got to be standards writers to this day, no one knows. And David Coleman, as you know, has gone on to be appointed as president of the College Board, where his first move was to align the SATs down to the level of Common Core's standards in the high school. He announced that at the very beginning, and he has also, as president, allowed the release of this advanced placement U.S. history test, which is not Common Core, but is under his auspices as the president of the College Board. But I'm only talking about the two sets of standards called Common Core. We have no idea, as I say, what their charge was, what they were paid to develop the ELA standards, but we do know that this bizarre committee that I was on, Common Core's Validation Committee, was also appointed in the middle of 2009 for the purpose of ensuring that the Common Core standards would be internationally benchmarked, research-based, and rigorous. And 5 of us, Professor Milgram, me, and 3 other people, refused to sign off. There were 29 altogether by the end of the year, from the form that was given to us in February, I just checked that, 2010. We were asked to sign off that these standards were all of that and even more. And we simply said that they didn't. We all agreed, at least Professor Milgram and I, and a third person who has identified, come out of the closet and spoken about his reasons recently in a blog about why he chose not to sign on. They weren't internationally benchmarked and they weren't rigorous. Why I call this committee a bizarre committee was because we all had to sign a confidentiality agreement at the first meeting that we would never discuss what happened in the meetings of our committee for the rest of our lives. Now, for someone who had been an open town meeting or a representative town meeting member, this was very stunning, very perplexing, but if we wanted to be on the committee, we had to sign, so we did. So that's why you can't find out anything about what happened on this committee, because we could be arrested or subpoenaed or something if we didn't say anything about what this committee actually did. But that was the overall, I mean, that's been part of the sort of cloak and dagger operation that we've been working with. Everything was done behind the scenes. And whatever you know is whatever they've chosen to let you know, because you have no access to records behind of what actually took place. The other peculiar aspect of this validation committee was that it was chosen by the people who ran the Common Core project itself. Now, you would have enough, all of you, even if you weren't in some official role in your local government, to know that if you want to have a particular policy or some implementation measured to see how successful it was or effective it was, you wouldn't ask the people who did it. You would ask other people, independent experts. But Common Core chose its own people to put on the validation committee. I know why I got on, because I clamored back in Massachusetts and I had previous reputation. Jim Milgram knows why he was put on, because then Governor Schwarzenegger in California knew that he had been one of the people who'd written California's own math standards and insisted that Jim Milgram get on this validation committee, but we don't know why anyone else got on, but they were chosen by the people running the project, which is not the way you have an independent validation or evaluation of a set of standards or anything. So, not surprising, most of the people on this committee validated the standards by May 2010, and this is the part I like to say with a smile, even though the final standards didn't come out until June. So we even have a mismatch in the dates. The form was first sent in February, so they were anticipating, obviously, a very rapid approval of a set of standards that were going to be developed in faster time than standards that have been developed historically anywhere. And then they wanted these approval forms passed in by the end of May, and the document finally came out on June 2nd, 2010. And as Jim Milgram has said, that final document was quite different from the public comment document he saw, so-called public comment document, that came out in March. Again, this is another little interesting issue. Historical, but it does give you a sense of things being controlled by other people, other forces behind the scenes. To this day, no one has commented on these little discrepancies and what was going on. Nevertheless, to this day, we can still say those standards are not internationally benchmarked, which means comparable to the standards out there in high-achieving countries, and they're not research-based in their critical features, and they are not rigorous. And yet, the talking points that you will hear from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or ExxonMobil will always include they are benchmarked, they're rigorous. There's rarely a reporter who will write an article without saying these are more demanding standards than we've had, or they are simply demanding standards. When most reporters themselves, and I used to check this regularly, I've spoken in the past 5 years to probably every reporter in the country, and I would ask them what they majored in. Could any of them evaluate a set of high school math standards? One reporter, and all those I've spoken to, he happened to have been a physics major, so that was why he could look at a high school set of standards and know what to expect or what not to expect. All the others couldn't. But did boards of ed, state boards of ed, ever ask their own higher education faculty? I used to ask that too when I testified. How many state legislators even bothered to call on the people whose salaries they pay at their own public universities? Every state has a major university. Certainly there were plenty in the Boston area. Never could get our own math, science, or engineering faculty to come and testify about these standards. No state board ever thought about it. They just voted it. Why? I know why Massachusetts did, and I've often been asked, well, why did they dump the best standards, among the best standards in the country? Well, we were promised $250 million of Race to the Top money. was very clear. That was what we were going to get, and we did get it. So that was a piece of what led to Massachusetts giving up its good standards. And it was very important for Massachusetts to be the sacrificial lamb because there was a lineup of commissioners of education who were watching to see what Massachusetts would do. And if Massachusetts went, then all the dominoes would fall down in order as well, which is exactly what happened. We voted July 2010, and within 3 months, without public hearings for the most part, or any discussion in their state legislature, all these states, up to almost 45 of them within 3 months, voted to adopt. And the funniest one to me was the fact that one of them, Kentucky, voted in February to adopt these standards before they were even written. So really there were some problems about somebody applying pressure, twisting arms, or promises being made. How do you, now, did these boards know about all the tentacles of Common Core? I doubt it. They're all intelligent, college-educated people for the most part. I don't know how New Jersey went about doing it, who was on the actual board here in New Jersey at the time, but I'm sure they had very much of an idea of tentacles that would be gradually coming out year after year. The data collection, certainly no one knew anything about the testing that would be done because the consortium were just going to get going and you would be part of the testing consortium and you are part of the PARC consortium, which is what Massachusetts is part of too. So you have people voting for something they don't understand in detail, possibly because they didn't think it was going to be much different from whatever standards were before. They didn't bother to ask for expert opinion, at least, whether they went along with it or not is a separate issue, but they could have at least asked for expert opinion, hold a few public discussions, didn't bother. So I still have not heard people who are on state boards of education to this day, this is 5 years, testify as to what went through their heads when they adopted these standards. We haven't had those kinds of people testifying. It still is amazing to me that state legislatures do not ask people who voted for the policy to explain on what basis did they vote for this policy. What did they know at the time? I don't understand that. We can't even get even the people who were doing these standards. I just testified a few days ago to a Georgia, by Skype, to a Georgia legislative committee that is looking at federal overreach, which is the way they're seeing this as a problem. And Milgram and I are being Skyped in, and they had heard from Chamber of Commerce, the state conference of whatever it's called, state legislatures, and I asked them, I said, how come you don't ask any of the other people to testify? The writers of the standards, the people who were in charge of the project physically, like Gene Wilhoit, Gates Foundation people, and one state legislator wrote back and said, we did actually ask a whole slew of these people. Not one of them wanted to testify. They refused. So here we have a continuation of a pattern of silence because they had sent out an invitation to the standards writers, David Coleman, Jason Zimba, Sue Pimentel, standards project director, Gene Wilhoit, people from the Gates Foundation, a few others. They can't get anyone to even testify on what was going on when they were developing the project. They don't want to be on record, apparently, for anything. So here we have state legislators in this country trying to get rid of peculiar sets of standards that were legally adopted by state boards because they had the statutory authority to do it. And about 25 to 30 states are now trying in different ways, and I know about the bill here in New Jersey, to either suspend your state testing or to defund it, and then to start, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, and to set up committees to develop better standards for their states, because they have finally reached the conclusion that there are some serious problems in both English and math, especially if they're also going to adopt, as I gather New Jersey just did, the next generation science standards, which are even worse than Common Core's math standards. And why New Jersey, which is a state comparable to Massachusetts in educational achievement, would do that? I don't know. I don't know if there were discussions, if they looked at what scientists had to say, because I do have a copy of a review by a group of scientists of these next generation science standards, which were developed by Achieve, and there's no high school chemistry, there's no high school physics that can be taught. Now, that doesn't mean that won't happen in some high schools in New Jersey, where you may have sensible departments and superintendents who will make sure that there are at least high school chemistry courses being offered, but they're certainly not going to be evaluated upon any national tests that might come out, because standards aren't there in so-called next generation science standards. Why the dumbing down? No one is saying that. They're all saying, oh, this is going to improve everybody. What do you do to engage in civil discourse when the people you're talking to, and this has been a dilemma for me because I'm an old League of Women Voters person, when they're simply lying over and over again, and you can't keep saying that because you don't move the conversation forward. But if you keep getting people telling you what you know are blatant distortions of the truth or just blatant lies, because they don't know anything better themselves, they've been given these talking points, and the people who created the project won't talk at all, how do you have informational sessions about these standards? Now, what is the problem with, and I just want to know how many minutes more I should talk to allow a little bit of time. 7 minutes. 7 minutes for my talk. Okay, and then we'll have, what, Q&A for a little bit? Okay. What are some of the problems with the ELA? And I've got this on a one-pager, which is posted on my website, but you can see dealing only with ELA because you will be hearing from a very competent algebra teacher who was on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel with me this afternoon on the math standards. But you can see that here are the missing standards in ELA. So some states that are now playing games with this issue, the governor is basically the one playing the game, says we're going to get rid of Common Core, and we're going to establish a way to get suggestions for revising Common Core. This took place in Florida a few months ago. I've gone through these various methodologies of how you fool people into thinking you're doing something when you're not really doing anything at all. And if you put up standard by standard online, on an online critique forum, and say, tell us whether the standard needs to be revised, should be deleted, or whatever you want to do with it. I said, well, how do you get at the missing standards? They're not going to show up. I was told the other day, oh, we're having crosswalks. And crosswalks are something that State Department of Ed people love to do in every state. Crosswalk means that you have a set of standards here to be compared to another set of standards, and you look to see whether the content matches. You go in both directions. I found one state that only went in one direction. They didn't want to know whether what they had in their old standards might have been better or fuller than what was in Common Core. So that was I could easily spot that problem. That was one of the Carolinas that had State Department of Ed that only did a crosswalk in one direction rather than in both directions. But crosswalks just tell you whether, to what degree, what's in one is in the other. But it doesn't tell you about developmental progressions through the grades. It doesn't tell you about the whole organizational framework, which is what I look at first because I've been doing this for so many years. It certainly doesn't capture missing standards so much if they are really missing in one document. Georgia, which is one of the states I've been most involved with this past week, had a whole grade 8 full of wonderful standards on Georgia texts and writers, one of whom was Flannery O'Connor, and the meeting was actually being held in Villageville, which is where she lived. And I thought it was ironic that that whole set of standards was not even captured in the crosswalk. Didn't even mention that they just had this wonderful set of 8th grade standards in ELA that captured what you'd want students in Georgia to know about, and the crosswalk didn't even notice that, or was not able to capture it. And it was ironic that this meeting, this hearing, was being held where she had a home. So you have missing standards. Now, overall deficits, let me just say a few words about. The problem with ELA is stress on writing, not reading. Any of you who are teachers will know about what's going on in classrooms where kids are spending a whole lot more time, even in mathematics, writing as opposed to doing math. Why is that wrong? I've got 3 minutes more. I'm going to do this very quickly. Because we know from 100 years of research that good writers were good readers. Kids need to spend more time, K-12, on good reading. That's how you get better writing. And they also are now spending more time reading something called informational text, not complex literary text, which is not the way to develop critical thinking. Analytical thinking comes from learning how to read between the lines, which is what good high school English teachers always did with complex literary works. Now, the rest you can see. Poorly written standards, I wanted to give you an example. One of the great problems, and this is true of both math and ELA, you have very poorly written standards. They were written in a hurry, and many of them are unreadable, or they have a bundle of activities put into one long sentence separated by colons and semicolons. I've tried to use that trick myself, but you don't get a very readable standard out of that. And then we have, at the very end of the ELA document, and this is where I'm going to finish off and entertain a few questions, because there's confusion about whether ELA is really just for ELA or for the rest of the curriculum. Well, this was apparently David Coleman and Sue Pimentel's idea. They wanted to have something that would mean that the rest of the subjects in the curriculum would be doing more reading. And so they added something called literacy standards, the last 7 or 8 pages in this 65-page document. Well, I just did a report with a couple of historians who looked at these literacy standards and also at the exemplars in this infamous Appendix B. And the historians said the literacy standards are not appropriate for the study of history because the literacy standards used for that part of the document that would be used supposedly by history teachers who would be teaching history content. Where that would come from, we don't know. The skills that historians would stress are skills like contextualization, sourcing, and corroboration for primary documents. Those are not the standards or skills you would apply to literary text. If you read Jane Austen's novels, you don't worry about corroboration. Did Jane Austen really write Pride and Prejudice, or did someone else write it? I mean, this is not a relevant question that you spend time in a high school English class on. Maybe a little bit of time on did Shakespeare write Shakespeare's plays, but that's, even then, you don't do that at the undergraduate level very often either. So we have literacy standards that at least the historians have said is inappropriate. Science teachers we haven't heard from. But we've got a whole lot of problems with the entire document. The only strand I have praised, because people said, is there anything in that document you like? And I said, well, yes, the K-5 reading fundamentals strand, because I know who wrote it. That was a good strand. But whether it's being taught appropriately, we don't know, because their schools of education are going to be controlling the shaping of the teachers who come in, and they're all being trained to teach to Common Core standards, which is another huge problem. I'm going to stop there, and I'd like to have whatever few questions you might be able to have before lunchtime.
Thanks. Thank you very much for being here. I do have a question, and I'm going to come at this from a different perspective. yes, it's about greed, it's about money, it's about power, and it's about control. But control by whom? Are the teachers and the Common Core advocates really pawns of being this nature, the socialist agenda that's sweeping the globe? Hitler said, you give me your children and in less than a generation, I will own your country. Is that what this is really all about? Sure, it's money and greed and everybody's having a great time. But I always look for the core problem, pardon the pun. And in my mind, I think that's what it's about. By undermining this country, and they're controlling every aspect of our life.
That's a good piece of it. This is a very fundamental question.
Right.
What is it all about ultimately?
Right.
Central planning, so far as we can see, and workforce development. If you get the data pieces put in from the testing, there will be teacher evaluation frameworks that come out of the testing, so teachers will be kept in line. And then you will have all of the pieces of information that will have to go from the testing consortium by contract up to the USDE if they want it. So many states have been trying to work out airtight laws or stat bills on the kind of information that kids can be allowed to talk about. But I don't think any of them are airtight, because as soon as a kid gets on a computer, remember these tests are computerized, even if some paper and pencil versions are available right now, the kid will have to say what his name is or her name, the teacher, the grade. Already there's information to be picked up. So you have a serious issue of central planning for workforce development, to put it charitably. We don't know damn it. But that's as much as we can see on the surface. I can't go into any of the other issues at all. Maybe we should have just another short question, if we have one. Yeah.
So today, in our universities and colleges, are they training the teacher students to use this curriculum?
Okay. This is a very important question. Are teachers' colleges training teachers, prospective teachers, or even professional development? Yes. This is now part of the new accreditation standards that came out last year. So there are a whole lot of pieces that had to be put into place. And I follow the accreditation standards that came out of the merger of the two private accrediting organizations. This is far more important than anyone understands. Education schools are really one of the major sources of our problems, leading to the development of Common Core. But the two older, NCATE and TIAC, those are the acronyms, for the two older accreditation agencies, they merged, came out with new standards last August, just a year ago. And one of the standards is that all new teachers should be trained to teach to Common Core standards. Now, that sort of locks the coffin in place, because if the teachers can't teach anything outside of Common Core, they're not teaching subjects, they're teaching Common Core's standards. This is a serious issue and can be handled at the state legislative level, because that is where teacher licensing regulations and tests are. That was one of the things I did in Massachusetts, so that's why I know. This is at every state can handle its own teacher licensing, administrator licensing regulations, and licensure tests for teachers. And it can do something about that situation if it has the right advice and has the willpower to tackle what are some very difficult problems in its own teacher training institutions. But that is where it's, unfortunately, they are being directed to teach the Common Core. Right?
Anybody that is in your leadership positions here tonight or any other time, I think it would be very apropos if we make sure we don't get the word teacher and facilitator mixed up.
Right.
Two different things.
Well,
Just to use the word teacher when you mean a trainer.
Well, the licensure regulations talk about the tests are for teachers, and it's very clear what licensure tests are for. I have just written a book, by the way, about what I did in Massachusetts, because that was the piece that I wanted to get written up, and it will probably be out next year. It's about licensure regulations and licensure tests for teachers. I'm focusing on them. And the reason why that's important was that I still believe, this is the thesis of my book in a sense, that it wasn't just the good standards we had in Massachusetts, it was all the other reforms that we were doing to strengthen the teaching corps. Because a basic thing to remember is that teachers cannot teach what they do not know. And if you want good teaching to high standards to take place in the future in New Jersey, your teachers have to be trained to teach to high standards, which means they've got to know the content or teaching to high standards. There was a question.
You mentioned something about having a website. Can you give that to us?
My homepage at the University of Arkansas can be accessed quickly by just Googling Sandra Stotsky, Arkansas, and then it will pop up one of the first items, and you just scroll down, and it's by month. I list all my testimony and everything else I've written, YouTubes, because I often get finally a YouTube or a video of a talk I've given, so everything I've written is there. Pioneer Institute is another one to go to because they produce a lot of reports and have been really fighting on this battle for Common Core because they go to leading scholars around the country for reports on different aspects of Common Core, including testing, which is a recent report they came out with. So those two are probably the best. Those two.
I know a number of years back, both professional organizations, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics and Teachers of English, were developing standards, national standards. Whatever happened to those standards, and what is the relationship now between those organizations and Common Core?
Okay, this will be the last question I answer because the 0 minutes is being waived here. But that's a good question. There were several waves of national standard development. First took place when NCTM in, I think, 1989 came out with its national standards. And people thought this was wonderful, that professional educational organizations do it. English teachers, NCTE was given some money by USDE at the time. This was under the Clinton administration. That's why this is interesting, and it's listed as an anecdote. And their first draft, they didn't want standards at all. I was a very active member of NCTE at the time. They bitterly fought. They didn't want any standards at all. They thought this was an imposition on K-12. But they were given money to develop it, so they were going to develop something called standards. And they sent in a first draft in about 93 or 94 to the U.S. Department of Ed, which was horrifying. It said, this isn't what we want. The New York Times said this isn't what we want. Albert Shanker, who was then still alive, said this isn't what we want. And they didn't get any more money. So they finished their standards, and they've had an unfortunate influence, but they're just 12 ridiculous statements. That's what it ended up as. And then by the time the history organizations developed their history standards, it set up such a firestorm that the U.S. Senate denounced them 99 to 1, and that ended professional organizations developing national standards. That was when we had the move to have state standards developed, because people concluded that we couldn't do much with those national teaching organizations. Let's have state standards do it. And that was when state standards began to be developed, and under Goals 2000, they were asked to develop them and test them if they could. Now, in the meantime, some states did, some states didn't, but it wasn't until No Child Left Behind 2001 that now there was congressional law that said you had to have state standards, state tests of your own choice, of your own choosing, and send in your data or results to Washington for determining AYP, adequate yearly progress. That was the camel's nose under the tent for Common Core and Race to the Top 10 years, less than 10 years later, because it opened up the door states developing standards, anything they want. Let's have one set of standards for the whole country instead of all these 50 sets of state standards. It was just pushing the envelope further. That's a very quick snapshot of the history of the standards movement. I leave you only with one final comment on that. I have looked at the history of education policy and effectiveness, and the federal government has not been effective in any educational policies it has promoted since, and this is where I give it credit, 1862, with the Morrill Acts that founded the land-grant universities. They were wonderful, but you have to go back as far as 1862 to the land-grant acts by Justin Morrill, who was a state legislator in Vermont. And after that, the federal role in education, which is constitutionally not supposed to be there, they haven't produced one effective policy in terms of raising student achievement. So to have this now happening in a vacuum of no effectiveness suggests that we've got serious problems if we think we're going to get anything good coming out of federal control of public education. In any event, I will be around.